In a recent video, I asked if the Council of the Australian War Memorial has legal cover under its Act to include frontier conflict, and I showed that it does not. The second question that I posed, that is, notwithstanding the Act, does the War Memorial have a case to do so? Here I will answer a not. But first, let me quote from Chairman of the War Memorial Council, Kim Beazley. He is quoted as saying that he supports, quote, proper recognition of frontier conflict, unquote, and he questions how the institution can, quote, have a history of Australian wars without that, unquote. He also says Aborigines must be, quote, afforded the dignity of resistance, unquote. Now here I make the point, one which I will make repeatedly throughout this campaign. The War Memorial is not a museum of war. It is a shrine to those who gave their lives in the service of this nation, not those who have died opposing its creation. Now, its museum and history function are subordinate to its role as a shrine. Beazley is ignoring his statutory obligation to conform to the Act, and is ignoring the views of millions of people whose Parliament enacted that legislation on the basis that he knows better. In other words, Chairman Kim, let's call him that from now on, it has a nice authoritarian ring to it. Chairman Kim is relying on the vibe of the thing. We should recognise the fact of frontier conflict and teach it as part of our history. To some, such acknowledgement in the War Memorial is merely a benign gesture, a healing gesture. But this so-called history is by no means settled. Chairman Kim, for all his good intentions, will not have the final say. If you hand your adversary a weapon, do not be surprised if he uses it. Once Chairman Kim has delivered for the activists, he will be politely elbowed into irrelevance, and the so-called frontier wars will be weaponised in a wider struggle. Because what is being proposed for the War Memorial is not history, but propaganda. Propaganda supporting an increasingly virulent insurgency campaign to divide Australia into two nations. We see it with the constant acknowledgements and welcome to country. We see it with the three flags. We see it with the voices to Parliament. We see it with the slavish deference to Aboriginal myths and culture. We see it with grants of native title over land that was never intended to be covered by the Mabo decision, a form of title that confers greater rights on those enjoyed by white title holders. The activists who are driving this initiative will use acceptance by the Australian War Memorial of this contested history to give legitimacy to the idea that Australia was brutally invaded, the people were dispossessed, and therefore this nation is illegitimate. Aboriginal Australia was not invaded by the British. In accordance with international law of the time, it was settled. It was invaded by the modern world. It was always going to happen. It was always going to be brutal. And it was always going to be ultimately going to be for the benefit of the descendants of those who were living at the time, provided it were done properly, which it largely was under British settlement and successive Australian governments, until Nugget Coombs abandoned the idea of assimilation and tried to turn back time. He has now consigned remote Aboriginal communities into a dysfunctional time warp. This is a crisis which makes the boutique concerns of the well-heeled Aboriginal elites seem obscene. Here let me quote from Professor Frank Bongiorno, writing in the ANU Reporter, Quote, "The Australian War Memorial is a morally charged national space that promotes a powerful origin story. National character finds its purest expression in Anzac, we are told. The story of frontier warfare is another powerful and arguably alternative foundational story. It tells us Australia was built on invasion, dispossession and violence, and that the nation can only ever approach authenticity and wholeness once it gives proper recognition to this reality." Unquote. No, no, no. The War Memorial has nothing to do with the national origin story. I will say it again. It is nothing more than a shrine to honour those who have died in the service of this nation. But it doesn't only honour the fallen. It also does honour to the nation that spawned those heroes, a nation to be proud of, a nation worth dying for. Yes, let's acknowledge our warts and all history, but let's confine it to the halls of academia, to secular museums, to parliamentary apologies, and even to annual sorry days if we must. Why would we daub the walls of our national shrine with the graffiti of grievance, the graffiti of invasion, dispossession, and violence? Now, this analogy is not perfect, but bear with me. We expect the Catholic Church to acknowledge and to atone for the depredations of predatory priests, but we do not expect it to dedicate a chapel to these events in St Mary's Cathedral.